The evidence is undeniable.
What's up?
The truth will prevail. Mr. Chairman, we present a path to a stronger future. And you believe this boy holds the key to that future?
I think I've found it.
Really? What does it say?
This is everything. We did it.
Yes.
I couldn't have done it without you all. We knew you could do it, boss. You're an inspiration.
The easiest way to steal a company is to convince everyone the founder is no longer needed. No one in the room would have dared say those words out loud. But if Charlotte Bennett could hear the private conversations happening behind polished glass walls and closed office doors, she would have recognized the truth immediately. 15 years earlier, there had been no boardroom, no corporate headquarters, and certainly no billion-dollar valuation. There was only Charlotte, a folding table, a borrowed laptop, and a dream that seemed far too ambitious for a woman in her late 20s working from a cramped apartment outside Seattle. While others saw risk, she saw opportunity. While investors dismissed her ideas, she spent nights refining them. While competitors chased trends, she focused on solving real problems. One customer became 10. 10 became 100. 100 became thousands. Year after year, she built the company piece by piece until it became one of the fastest-growing technology firms in America. Employees often joked that Charlotte knew every hallway, every product launch, and every challenge because she had personally lived through all of them. She remembered the first office lease, the first major client, and even the first holiday party attended by fewer than 20 people. Her fingerprints were on everything the company had become. That was why the applause felt so genuine whenever she stepped onto a stage at industry conferences. To employees, she was more than an executive. She was the reason the company existed. Yet success has a strange way of changing the people around it. As revenues climbed and new investors arrived, the culture slowly shifted. The company that once celebrated innovation began celebrating influence. The people who once admired Charlotte's determination started measuring power in titles and voting shares. New executives entered the picture. Consultants arrived. Advisors offered opinions. Among them was Ethan Whitmore, the charismatic chairman whose confidence impressed investors and whose polished speeches captivated analysts. Publicly, Ethan praised Charlotte's leadership. Privately, he began building relationships that didn't include her. Charlotte noticed small changes but dismissed them. Meetings happened without her. Strategic discussions appeared on calendars after decisions had already been made. People who once sought her advice suddenly seemed distracted whenever she entered a room. Even so, she remained focused on the business. She believed results would speak louder than politics. The latest quarter had exceeded expectations. Customer growth was setting records. Industry publications were predicting another breakthrough year. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But beneath the surface, something was changing. The very success Charlotte had created was attracting people who believed the company's future belonged to them. As she stood in her corner office overlooking the Seattle skyline, reviewing plans for the next phase of expansion, she had no idea that several floors below, conversations were already taking place about a future that did not include her. And what those people were planning would soon force the woman who built the company to fight for her place inside it. Power rarely changes hands in a single meeting. It changes hands through quiet conversations that nobody notices until the outcome is already decided. 3 weeks after Charlotte Bennett stood in her office planning the company's next expansion, Ethan Whitmore sat at the head of a private dinner attended by several influential board members and major investors. The restaurant overlooked Elliott Bay, and the atmosphere was relaxed, but the discussion was anything but casual. While Charlotte spent her evenings reviewing product roadmaps and customer growth reports, Ethan was focused on something entirely different. He was building consensus. One conversation at a time, he began planting a simple idea. The company had outgrown its founder. At first, the suggestion sounded almost ridiculous. After all, Charlotte was responsible for the company's success. The numbers proved it. Revenue was climbing. Customer retention was strong. Employee satisfaction remained among the highest in the industry. But Ethan understood something important. Facts rarely move people as effectively as narratives do. Instead of criticizing Charlotte directly, he framed the discussion differently. He spoke about the future. He spoke about scalability. He spoke about institutional leadership. He asked whether the company needed a different kind of executive for its next chapter. The questions sounded reasonable. That was what made them dangerous. Over the following days, those questions spread throughout the leadership team. Senior executives began repeating phrases they had heard in private meetings. Analysts discussed leadership evolution. Advisors spoke about modernization. No one openly attacked Charlotte, but the conversation itself was changing. Slowly, the focus shifted away from what she had built and toward whether she was still the right person to lead it. Charlotte noticed the shift during executive meetings. Ideas that once received immediate support suddenly faced resistance. Projects she approved were questioned. Decisions that would have taken minutes now required endless discussions. The atmosphere felt different, but she could not yet identify the source. One afternoon, she walked into a conference room and found several senior leaders ending a conversation the moment she arrived. The room became uncomfortably quiet. Forced smiles replaced genuine engagement. It lasted only seconds, but Charlotte felt it immediately. Something was happening behind the scenes. That evening, she called a trusted colleague she had worked with for more than a decade. She asked a simple question. Was there something she needed to know? The hesitation before the answer told her everything. Her colleague admitted that unusual meetings had been taking place. Discussions about succession. Discussions about leadership structure. Discussions that somehow always happened when Charlotte was not present. For the first time in years, uncertainty entered her mind. Not because she feared competition. Competition never frightened her. What concerned her was secrecy. Companies solve problems through transparency. Politics thrive in darkness. The next morning, an email appeared on executive calendars announcing a special board strategy session scheduled for the following week. Attendance was mandatory. No agenda was attached. No details were provided. The message was unusually brief. Charlotte stared at the screen for several moments before closing her laptop. Across the city, Ethan Whitmore received confirmation that every board member would attend. He leaned back in his chair, confident that events were moving exactly as planned. What neither side realized was that the meeting they were preparing for would become the beginning of a battle that would determine who truly controlled the company. The conference room on the 32nd floor was already full when Charlotte Bennett arrived. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Seattle, and the long walnut table was surrounded by the people who held the most influence inside the company she had spent 15 years building. Normally, conversations filled the room before meetings began. That morning felt different. The moment Charlotte walked in, several discussions ended abruptly. A few board members nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Charlotte took her seat without saying a word, quietly observing the atmosphere around her. Ethan Whitmore sat at the head of the table with the calm confidence of someone who believed events were unfolding exactly as intended. Once everyone was seated, the meeting began. Ethan opened with routine updates about market performance and investor sentiment. First, nothing seemed unusual. Then the discussion shifted. One board member raised concerns about future leadership. Another questioned whether the company's next phase required a different management structure. A third suggested that growth had become too dependent on a single individual. Charlotte listened carefully. None of the comments mentioned her directly, but everyone in the room understood who they were talking about. As the discussion continued, the criticism became more pointed. Executives who had praised her leadership only months earlier now expressed concerns about adaptability and long-term vision. Investors who had celebrated record-breaking results suddenly focused on hypothetical risks that had not yet appeared. Charlotte remained composed, but internally she was beginning to understand the scope of what had been happening behind closed doors. This was not a spontaneous discussion. It was a coordinated effort. Every comment seemed connected to the next. Every concern reinforced the one before it. The narrative had already been prepared. Finally, Ethan folded his hands and addressed the room. He spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded professional and measured. He acknowledged Charlotte's contributions. He praised her commitment. He thanked her for helping build an extraordinary company. Then he delivered the statement that changed everything. He explained that the board needed to discuss leadership matters privately and requested that Charlotte leave the room while deliberations continued. For several seconds, complete silence filled the boardroom. Charlotte looked around the table. She saw familiar faces, people she had hired, people she had mentored, people whose careers had advanced because she believed in them. Not one person spoke up. Not one person objected. The absence of support felt louder than any criticism could have. Slowly, Charlotte gathered her notebook and stood. Her expression remained calm, but the room could feel the weight of the moment. The founder of the company was being asked to leave a meeting about the future of the company she created. As she walked toward the door, she could feel dozens of eyes following her. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked relieved. A few appeared almost triumphant. Charlotte paused briefly before exiting. She turned back toward the room and looked at the people seated around the table. There was no anger in her face. No argument. No desperate attempt to defend herself. She simply nodded once and left. The door closed quietly behind her. Inside the boardroom, discussions resumed almost immediately. Outside, Charlotte stood alone in the hallway overlooking the city skyline. The meeting was proceeding exactly as her opponents wanted. What they did not realize was that forcing her out of the room would become the mistake they would eventually regret the most. Charlotte Bennett remained standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows long after the boardroom door closed. Behind her, below, thousands of people moved through downtown Seattle without any idea that the future of a billion-dollar company was being debated just a few feet away. For the first time in many years, she was completely outside the conversation. Yet what surprised her most was not the betrayal. It was the clarity. Over the previous several weeks, pieces of a confusing puzzle had finally fallen into place. The delayed responses, the private meetings, the unusual resistance to successful initiatives, the sudden change in attitude from executives who once supported her. None of it had been random. It had been organized. As painful as the realization was, it also brought certainty. She no longer had to wonder what was happening. She knew. Her phone vibrated. The screen displayed a message from a senior employee she trusted. The message was brief. "Are you okay?" Charlotte stared at the words for several seconds before typing a simple reply. "I will be." She put the phone away and took a deep breath. Throughout her career, she had faced product failures, economic downturns, investor rejections, and fierce competition. Every challenge had taught her the same lesson. Emotion could cloud judgment. Facts created solutions. Right now, she needed facts. Leaving the hallway, she headed toward her office. The building felt strangely different. Employees greeted her respectfully, but whispers followed behind closed doors. News traveled quickly in large organizations. People sensed something significant was happening. Inside her office, Charlotte sat down and opened several files she had not reviewed in years. The earliest documents from the company's formation, partnership agreements, governance records, original investment structures. Most founders rarely revisited those papers after success arrived. Charlotte had always kept copies, not because she expected conflict, but because she respected history. Every company has a story, and every story leaves a paper trail. As she reviewed the documents, memories returned. The first investor meeting, the first legal agreement, the countless nights spent protecting the company during its fragile early years. Many of the people currently questioning her leadership had not even been involved during those difficult beginnings. They had joined after success was already visible. Charlotte continued reading for hours. Outside, daylight slowly faded into evening. Across town, Ethan Whitmore was likely celebrating what he believed was a successful day. He probably assumed she was defeated. He probably assumed being excluded from the boardroom had weakened her position. What he did not understand was that Charlotte had never built her career on popularity. She built it on preparation. Late that evening, she reached a section of documents that caused her to stop reading. Her eyes moved across a page she had not examined in years. Then she read it again and again. The language was clear. The implications were significant. A detail that had been forgotten by almost everyone still existed in writing. Charlotte slowly leaned back in her chair. For the first time since leaving the boardroom, a small smile appeared on her face. The people trying to remove her believed they understood the company better than anyone else. But they had overlooked something important. They were studying the present while she remembered the beginning. And hidden inside that beginning was a piece of information powerful enough to change everything. The document had been sitting in company archives for nearly 15 years. During that time, hundreds of executives, attorneys, consultants, and investors had reviewed portions of the company's history, yet almost nobody had paid attention to a single provision buried inside the original governance agreement. Charlotte Bennett understood why. At the time it was written, the company was little more than a startup operating on determination and optimism. The clause seemed insignificant then. Now it had the potential to change the future of everything. Charlotte spent the next morning meeting with an attorney who had been involved during the company's earliest years. The attorney was semi-retired and no longer participated in day-to-day corporate matters, but he immediately recognized the document when Charlotte placed it on the conference table. He adjusted his glasses, reviewed the language carefully, and remained silent for several moments. Finally, he looked up. The expression on his face confirmed what Charlotte had begun to suspect. The provision was still valid. More importantly, it had never been amended, challenged, or removed. For years, everyone had assumed later agreements superseded the original structure. They were wrong. The legal foundation established during the company's earliest days still existed beneath everything that followed. Charlotte asked several questions. The attorney answered each one carefully. By the end of the meeting, uncertainty had been replaced by confidence. She now understood why her instincts had told her to revisit the company's origins. Sometimes the most powerful answers were hidden in places nobody bothered to look. Meanwhile, Ethan Whitmore continued moving forward with his plan. Within executive circles, confidence was growing. Rumors suggested leadership changes were inevitable. Several board members privately discussed what the organization would look like once Charlotte was no longer influential. Some executives began aligning themselves more closely with Ethan, hoping proximity to power would benefit their careers. The atmosphere inside headquarters shifted further each day. Employees noticed it. Managers noticed it. Investors noticed it. Yet nobody knew that a critical piece of information remained hidden from almost everyone involved. Later that week, Charlotte received a call from one of the company's earliest investors. He had heard rumors about the boardroom conflict and wanted to understand what was happening. Their conversation lasted more than an hour. By the time it ended, Charlotte realized something important. Many long-term stakeholders still trusted her deeply. They had not forgotten who built the company. They had not forgotten who guided it through difficult years. They simply lacked information. Others soon reached out as well. Former advisors, early investors, long-time supporters. None of them could change events alone, but together they represented a network of influence that Ethan had underestimated. As conversations continued, a larger picture began emerging. The upcoming vote was being treated as a formality by those expecting Charlotte's defeat. In reality, it was becoming something entirely different. It was becoming a test of memory, a test of loyalty, a test of whether the people connected to the company valued appearance more than substance. On Friday evening, Charlotte sat alone in her office as the city lights illuminated the skyline beyond her windows. The original document rested on her desk beside several new legal opinions confirming its significance. She knew difficult days still lay ahead. She knew powerful people expected her to disappear quietly. But for the first time since being forced out of the boardroom, she understood that the battle was far from over. In fact, the people preparing to celebrate victory were unknowingly walking toward a surprise that would soon leave an entire room speechless. The morning of the vote arrived with an unusual sense of anticipation throughout the company. Employees gathered in break rooms, executives exchanged quiet conversations in hallways, and investors monitored developments from across the country. Officially, the meeting was described as a routine governance matter. Unofficially, everyone understood its significance. The future leadership of the company would soon be decided. Ethan Whitmore entered headquarters that morning carrying the confidence of a man who believed the outcome had already been secured. Over the previous weeks, he had built alliances, influenced conversations, and shaped expectations. Several board members greeted him warmly as he made his way toward the executive conference floor. Their expressions suggested certainty rather than curiosity. To them, the vote felt less like a decision and more like a confirmation. Inside the boardroom, preparations were already underway. Legal counsel reviewed procedural requirements. Corporate secretaries organized voting materials. Senior executives settled into their seats. The atmosphere felt formal, but beneath the professionalism was unmistakable tension. Everyone knew that once the process began, there would be no turning back. Ethan took his place at the head of the table and exchanged a few quiet remarks with board members seated nearby. More than once, he glanced toward the entrance. Charlotte Bennett had not yet arrived. Some interpreted her absence as resignation. Others assumed she was preparing a final statement before accepting defeat. Either way, few expected surprises. Then, precisely 10 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, the boardroom doors opened. Conversations stopped immediately. Charlotte entered carrying a slim leather portfolio and wearing the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the entire conflict. There was no visible frustration, no anger, no sign of panic. If anything, she appeared more composed than she had been in months. Several people exchanged confused looks. They had expected someone fighting to keep power. Instead, they saw someone who seemed completely comfortable with whatever was about to happen. Charlotte quietly greeted a few board members before taking her seat. The reaction around the room was subtle but noticeable. Some directors who had avoided eye contact during previous meetings now appeared uncertain. Others watched her carefully, trying to understand what had changed. Ethan noticed it as well. For the first time that morning, a small crack appeared in his confidence. Not because Charlotte had said anything. She had not. It was because she did not look worried. The meeting officially began. Preliminary reports were presented. Financial summaries were reviewed. Governance procedures were outlined. Every step moved the company closer to the vote everyone had come to witness. Yet as the agenda progressed, a strange feeling spread through the room. The certainty that had existed only hours earlier was beginning to fade. People sensed that something remained unspoken, something important. Finally, legal counsel announced that before voting could proceed, any relevant matters affecting governance or shareholder rights needed to be disclosed for the record. It was a routine requirement that rarely generated discussion. Ethan nodded confidently. He expected the process to continue without interruption. Instead, Charlotte slowly opened her portfolio and stood. Every eye in the room turned toward her. The document she placed on the table looked ordinary enough. A few sheets of paper, a set of signatures, nothing more. Yet the moment the company's outside attorney recognized what she had submitted, the expression on his face changed completely. And suddenly, the outcome everyone thought was inevitable no longer seemed certain at all. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The attorney carefully lifted the document from the table and reviewed the signatures one more time as if he wanted to make absolutely certain he was not misunderstanding what he was seeing. Across the room, board members exchanged confused glances. Ethan Whitmore remained composed, but the confidence that had defined his morning was beginning to fade. Charlotte Bennett stood quietly beside her chair and waited. She had no need to interrupt. The document was speaking for itself. Finally, the attorney cleared his throat and addressed the room. He explained that the provisions submitted by Charlotte originated from the company's founding governance agreement and had never been superseded by later amendments. Several directors immediately challenged the interpretation. Others requested clarification. The attorney responded by citing specific sections, legal reviews, and supporting opinions that had been independently verified. The room grew increasingly silent with every explanation. What many people had assumed was an outdated formality turned out to be a binding provision with significant implications. Years earlier, when the company was struggling to survive, investors had agreed to grant special governance protections to the founder. At the time, the provision seemed unimportant because nobody imagined the company would become a billion-dollar enterprise. As success arrived, attention shifted elsewhere. Executives changed, boards evolved, strategies developed, yet the original protection remained untouched. It had simply been forgotten. Ethan leaned forward and began asking questions. His tone remained professional, but the urgency was impossible to miss. He wanted to know why the issue had never been raised before. He wanted to know why corporate counsel had not flagged it. He wanted to know whether there was any basis for challenging its validity. The answers were not what he wanted to hear. The document had always been available. The records had always existed. The provision had remained enforceable the entire time. No one had hidden it. People had simply stopped paying attention to the company's earliest history. Around the table, the mood shifted dramatically. Directors who had arrived expecting a straightforward vote now found themselves reevaluating everything they thought they knew. Some appeared frustrated. Others looked embarrassed. A few seemed impressed by Charlotte's preparation. More importantly, several influential stakeholders participating remotely began asking their own questions. They wanted explanations. They wanted context. They wanted to understand why a founder responsible for creating extraordinary shareholder value had been pushed aside in the first place. What had started as a routine leadership transition was becoming a much larger conversation about trust and judgment. Charlotte answered every question calmly. She never attacked Ethan. She never accused anyone of bad intentions. Instead, she focused on facts. She explained the company's history. She explained why the provision existed. She explained that she had only revisited the document after realizing decisions were being made without transparency. Her restraint proved surprisingly powerful. The more composed she remained, the more credibility she gained. Hours passed as attorneys, directors, and investors reviewed information. Eventually, the governance questions were resolved. The provision stood. The voting process would continue under a framework very different from the one Ethan had expected. As preparations resumed, the atmosphere inside the boardroom had completely transformed. The certainty that once favored Ethan was gone. No one could confidently predict the outcome anymore. Yet one thing had become unmistakably clear. The trap designed to remove Charlotte had begun closing around the people who created it, and the actual vote was still moments away. By late afternoon, the boardroom felt nothing like it had that morning. Hours earlier, Ethan Whitmore had entered expecting confirmation of his strategy. Now every person in the room understood that the outcome remained uncertain. The assumptions that once favored one side had been replaced by questions, and questions have a way of changing everything. The final stage of the process was about to begin. The vote. Corporate counsel reviewed the procedures one last time while directors prepared their ballots. Remote participants connected from New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Dallas, and several international locations. Major shareholders observed closely. Senior executives remained unusually quiet. Nobody wanted to distract from the moment that would determine the company's future. Charlotte Bennett sat calmly at her place at the table. She had spent weeks enduring speculation, criticism, and exclusion, yet she showed no sign of resentment. Her attention remained focused on the process itself. Across from her, Ethan maintained a professional expression, but the confidence that once defined him had been replaced by tension. He understood the stakes. More importantly, he understood that control was slipping away from certainty and into the hands of voters. The first ballots were submitted, then the second round, then additional votes from remote participants. The corporate secretary carefully recorded every result while attorneys monitored compliance procedures. At first, nobody could identify a clear trend. Support appeared divided. A few votes favored Ethan's preferred leadership structure. Others favored Charlotte. The room remained silent except for the sound of papers moving across the table and occasional procedural instructions. As additional results arrived, subtle changes became visible. Directors began exchanging glances. Some checked notes repeatedly. Others sat perfectly still, studying the numbers as they accumulated. Little by little, a pattern emerged. Charlotte was performing better than many observers had predicted. Then she began performing significantly better. The momentum shifted gradually at first, then all at once. Several influential stakeholders who had remained undecided ultimately sided with the founder. Long-term investors cited her track record. Others emphasized stability, credibility, and institutional memory. The arguments that had once justified replacing her suddenly seemed less persuasive when compared with 15 years of proven results. Ethan listened carefully as each new tally was announced. He never interrupted. He never challenged the process. But everyone could see the realization forming. The coalition he believed was secure had begun unraveling. Some of the same people who privately supported his plan now appeared unwilling to ignore the facts placed before them. By the time the final group of votes was counted, the atmosphere inside the boardroom had become almost surreal. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Every person present understood that a decisive moment had arrived. The corporate secretary reviewed the final totals one last time before handing the official results to legal counsel. The attorney examined the document carefully, confirmed the count, and stood to address the room. Several directors leaned forward. Ethan stared at the table. Charlotte remained calm. The result was not close. It was not controversial. It was not open to interpretation. The votes had produced a clear and overwhelming decision. In a room where many people once believed her influence was fading, Charlotte Bennett had just secured one of the most decisive victories in the company's history. Yet the most remarkable part was not the margin itself. It was what the outcome revealed. The people who knew the company's story best had remembered exactly who built it, and now only one final announcement remained. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but to everyone inside the boardroom it felt much longer. Legal counsel finished reading the official results and placed the document on the table. The numbers were final. The decision was official. The company had chosen its future, and that future belonged to Charlotte Bennett. Around the room, reactions varied. Some directors looked relieved. Others appeared stunned. A few quietly lowered their eyes, reflecting on the events that had brought them to this moment. For weeks, assumptions had dominated conversations. Predictions had shaped strategies. Private alliances had influenced decisions. Yet when the people with the authority to decide were finally given the opportunity to speak through their votes, they delivered a message that could not be ignored. Trust mattered. Results mattered. Leadership mattered. Ethan Whitmore remained seated as the reality settled across the room. To his credit, he accepted the outcome without argument. He understood that challenging the result would only undermine the process he had spent weeks promoting. The vote had been conducted properly. The decision was legitimate. The room gradually turned its attention toward Charlotte. The founder who had been excluded from discussions, questioned behind closed doors, and asked to leave the boardroom now found herself at the center of the company's future. Yet what happened next surprised many people even more than the vote itself. Charlotte did not celebrate. She did not criticize her opponents. She did not revisit old grievances or point out mistakes. Instead, she stood and thanked everyone who had participated in the process. Her voice remained calm and steady. She spoke about responsibility rather than victory. She spoke about the future rather than the past. She reminded the room that companies succeed when talented people work together toward common goals, not when individuals focus on personal rivalries. The simplicity of her message carried tremendous weight. Many people expected a moment of vindication. What they witnessed instead was leadership. Charlotte acknowledged that disagreements were inevitable inside any growing organization. Different perspectives often strengthen decision-making. However, she emphasized that transparency, respect, and accountability must remain the foundation of every important conversation. Several directors nodded in agreement. Others listened quietly, Even those who had opposed her appeared to respect the dignity with which she handled the moment. As the meeting concluded, the board formally confirmed her appointment as Chief Executive Officer. The announcement triggered applause throughout the room. It began with a few people, then more joined. Soon, nearly everyone was participating, not because they were celebrating a political victory, but because they recognized what the moment represented. The founder who built the company had earned the confidence of those entrusted with protecting its future. Later that evening, employees across headquarters received the official announcement. Messages of support poured in from offices throughout the country. Investors responded positively. Industry analysts praised the stability of the outcome. The uncertainty that had clouded the organization for weeks began to disappear. As the building slowly emptied and city lights illuminated the Seattle skyline once again, Charlotte returned to the same office where she had spent countless nights building the company from an idea into a success story. She looked out over the city and reflected on everything that had happened. The lesson was not about winning a vote. It was not about defeating rivals. It was something far simpler. Titles can be granted. Influence can shift. Power can change hands. But genuine leadership is earned through years of integrity, sacrifice, and commitment. And in the end, the people who mattered most had remembered exactly who she was.
Sometimes the greatest victory aren't won with a loud voice or the greater power. They're won through integrity, patience, and never forget where you came from. Charlotte didn't save the company because she's the strongest person in the room. She saved it because she prepared and stayed true to her value and never forget the promises that she made from the beginning. This story reminds us success may attract envy, but character earns lasting respect. If this story inspires you, share it with someone who needs this. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, remember to like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment below.